Dear listeners and viewers of Khabarhub and Radio Candid, Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to the special interview with Dr. John Blaxland. Dr. John Blaxland is Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies, a Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University, and a former military intelligence officer. Professor Blaxland is an expert of military history, intelligence, security, and Asia-Pacific affairs. He has published several books on these issues. He is former director of Joint Intelligence Operations at Headquarters Joint Operations Command and served as Australia's defense attaché to Thailand and Myanmar. He holds a Ph.D. in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada and a Master in History from Australian National University. Today we'll be discussing Australia's role in Indo-Pacific, Australia-China relations, and its relation with South Asia in general and Nepal in particular. Professor Blaxland, welcome to Khabarhub. Thank you very much for providing us your valuable time. Professor, the first question we have for you is, what is Australia's defense agenda in the contested Indo-Pacific? How is it different or similar to any other conventional alliance?
Thanks, Pramod. Great pleasure to be with you on the program. Great question. And Australia's defence agenda, it's an interesting one because we've been a treaty ally of the United States since 1951, and that has been a key pillar to Australia's security outlook for the last 70 years. In fact, going back earlier to the Second World War, but 1951 was when that was formalised. And what we've seen is, for the last 30 years until recently, with the end of the Cold War, the American unipolar moment meant that we felt fairly comfortable that we didn't have to do too much of our own heavy lifting in terms of hard power development and application of force anywhere in the world. So we happily contributed to UN peacekeeping missions in the 1990s. Then when things started to hot up in our neighbourhood, we contributed forces to resolve a situation in Bougainville, East Timor, and Solomon Islands in the Pacific. And then, of course, when things happened in Washington and New York on 9/11, 20 years ago, Australia contributed to the US-led missions in Afghanistan and then subsequently in Iraq. Now, what we hadn't quite appreciated was what a catastrophe they would be, and how much they would actually sap American resolve, American power, and American resources at a time when China was rising and the great power equation across the Eurasian landmass and beyond was altering dramatically, and in a way that pundits had not quite appreciated. So we face a world today where, particularly since the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, that tipping point, if you like, where China's rise did really seem to be accelerated and America's power seems to be eclipsed, if not overtaken. But what we've seen from an Australian point of view is a kind of a shift. We've started to see the world differently. Not that we want the alliance to fade, but that we realise, particularly in the last 5 years or so, with America's challenges domestically, politically, with the Make America Great and America First phenomenon of the Trump administration, and then the kind of apparent American uncertainty about its posture in places like Afghanistan and elsewhere. It's led Australia to think more about having to do more of its own heavy lifting and invest more in its own neighbourhood. Now, this has been complemented by the challenges of environmental concerns, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of other governance challenges such as terrorism, people smuggling, drug smuggling, and the breakdown of law and order, particularly in some of the smaller states in the Pacific Islands and in Southeast Asia. So the combination of all of those factors has seen Australia try and place much greater emphasis on what I call Australia's Foreign Policy Plan B. The Foreign Policy White Paper of 2017 articulated the plan to invest more heavily in its relations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and then beyond that across the Indo-Pacific in South Asia and East Asia and beyond. And that was, I think, a really positive plan. The government, I think, has found it difficult to follow up on that plan. It's to stick to it. Nonetheless, broadly speaking, the direction of that plan is a constructive one. So that's, I guess, where we stand. We remain a US ally, one looking warily at American resolve to do what it has done for us, effectively being a security guarantee and a guarantor of stability, which is widely recognised as a precursor of economic prosperity. And so as we look to maintain our economic prosperity, we are looking to reach out for connections around the region and beyond, mindful that in this day and age, our own economic prosperity is more interlinked with our neighbours than ever before, with global trade connections and interdependencies, making Australia a more internationally minded country than it probably has ever been.
Thank you, Professor. When it comes to Quad, how parallel are the United States, Australia, Japan, and India's aspirations and goals?
Yeah, the Quad, it's an interesting proposition. It's started out as a talk fest, if you like, and it's gained a bit of momentum, clearly with a security dimension prominent, that has gained economic and political and other social dimensions as well. My sense is, though, that the Quad has its detractors, many in Southeast Asia, for instance, in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, are nervous about what the Quad might mean for them. They're worried about the centrality of ASEAN being undermined, and they're worried about great power contestation being fought over in their own backyard in Southeast Asian the region. The Quad is obviously facing significant challenges because you've got to ask yourself, what is it that's holding the Quad together? And clearly one of the things that is, it's the concern about the way that particularly China, to a certain extent Russia, are acting in a assertive and dare I say malevolent manner. And that is driving these four countries to work together. Japan, Australia, similarly, both US allies, long-standing US allies, have been nervous about American resolve and also eager to engage India, I should say, as a potential great power ally in a bit of a balancing act as China's rise has increasingly threatened and cajoled Japan and Australia, both of which have been recipients of significant assertive and, dare I say, aggressive Chinese actions aimed at drawing a response from Japan and Australia of backing down and agreeing to Chinese pressure demands. Now, both Japan and Australia have resisted those demands, Japan obviously being much closer to China than Australia, feeling that much more acutely and feeling the need for a great power partner across the Eurasian landmass, a country like India, as being part of that. So Japan has reached out, made significant overtures towards India to make the Quad work. And Australia originally was invited when we had Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to join the Quad back in 2007. We originally backed out in an attempt to placate China, but as it turned out, that attempt to placate them was relatively ineffective, arguably futile, and we've seen subsequently a reinvigoration of the rationale for joining the Quad to give Australia greater leverage, greater connectivity with India, and greater Indian Ocean interoperability, mindful that China is very much an Indian Ocean player as well, and that if Australia wants to be able to exercise some leverage, it needs to do so alongside India. So very interesting dynamics at work. My concern is, though, that while the security dimension of the Quad is growing in the ties are growing between them, there is a real need for other dimensions. And I wrote about this in a piece in East Asia Forum with my colleague Ashok Sharma, Dr. Ashok Sharma, about the need for the Quad to be an instrumentality that includes an economic dimension and that is mindful of the environmental concerns of the region, of the Indo-Pacific region. So there's some scope for growth in the Quad. It has its limitations. It's not perfect. Each of those four countries have different reasons, different priorities, but they at the moment have sufficiently overlapping national interests that are driving them to cooperate more effectively together. And the great irony is that China's attempts to try and break us all off has driven those four countries closer together. China's actions in the Himalayas on the line of actual control appears to have driven a considerable reaction in India. Similarly, the actions around the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea have generated a fairly strong reaction in Japan, as has the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy and sharp exercise of Chinese sharp power against Australian trade and rhetoric against Australia generated quite a strong reaction in Australia against China. The lack of goodwill towards China is palpable in these countries now, and it is the greatest irony is that China's soft power is it's not that strong despite its economic power, and that's the Quad exists because of surprising resurgence in Chinese belligerence.
Thank you, sir. With the rise of minilateralism as a preferred format for states to meet the challenges of great power competition, how might diplomacy evolve to match the shifting security landscape of the coming decade? How effective is minilateralism as a tool to deal with the rising hybrid threats and grey zone?
So, great question. Minilateralism seems to be very much in vogue, in part because some of the bigger institutions have got a bit of a political gridlock. The United Nations, for instance, with the veto powers of the UN Security Council members, the permanent five, there's always one side or the other that's objecting to something and refusing to allow the UN to make progress on an issue. Similarly, with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, which is an organization in which many have had considerable hope for the future. It's an organization essentially also experiencing a degree of gridlock because of the requirement to operate with unanimity for all 10 countries, member states to agree. And of course, at the moment, they're all experiencing considerable pressure, particularly from China, but conversely from the United States as well, to take positions that they're uncomfortable taking. And that means that in the absence of those kinds of bodies being able to exercise the power and the authority that people had hoped they might be able to generate, we're seeing minilateral measures like the Quad emerging as the kind of go-to mechanism that's a viable alternative in the short to medium term as a way of addressing these concerns. Now, you touch on grey zone or grey zone operations, or much of that is about seeking to achieve political effects without declaring war, without physically, firing missiles or guns and at each other. Now, that's getting tricky. We've seen that in the South China Sea with the not quite gunboat diplomacy, but the use of white painted ships, Coast Guard vessels, and maritime militia to gain de facto control over the South China Sea. Coupled that with the really acerbic and quite aggressive rhetoric coming out from Beijing, and coupled with trade sanctions and attempts to manipulate through foreign interference people in countries like Australia and elsewhere who may have a connection with China directly or indirectly. And that's through personal links, but also increasingly now with cyber attacks. Our societies have gone from being web enabled to web dependent, and as a result becoming web vulnerable. And these web vulnerable societies like ours are now ones that can be reached from afar through the internet, through the ether, if you like, and can be manipulated and driving. And these concerns are driving real problems for national institutions, for industries. Australia's been subject to a cyber attack many times. My own university has been subject to cyber attacks. Banking industries have been subject to it. Television channel networks have been closed down, almost closed down by cyber attack. Our own parliament's been subject to it. But we're seeing a level of aggressive action that's kind of really driving a concern that we need to change the way we respond and actually work collectively to build our defences to push back and resist this kind of very offensively minded grey zone operations.
Thank you. What hopes does Australia have for the forthcoming first in-person Quad Summit expected to be held this fall in Washington, D.C.? What areas will Australia be looking forward to discuss during the meet?
So what they are going to meet and discuss will be, I don't have complete clarity on that. I don't have visibility on the agendas directly, but I think reading the environment, the circumstances and the issues that are bubbling away at the moment, there is clearly a concern about what's happening with the response to the pandemic. The COVID-19 seems to be a real challenge for all four Quad countries, but it's a challenge for the world. And the Quad countries are ones that are actually quite well resourced and placed to address these challenges if they can get their own house in order. Now, we know India's been suffering from the pandemic, the fourth wave, the Delta wave, if you like. Australia now too. I'm operating from home in part today because of a lockdown in Canberra, where I am, because of an outbreak of the pandemic of the Delta variant in Canberra. And so these are issues that they're local, but they're also regional and global. And the Quad has to respond to those, in addition to the challenges that we've already talked about: cyber attacks, maritime militia, the assertiveness of China in wolf warrior diplomacy and in sharp power, exercise of sharp power through trade sanctions and the like. I think it's really important for these countries to work to coordinate their message. If they want to be effective, and I think they do, they need to work to coordinate. So there's a broad range of issues there: pandemic related, environment related, great power contestational related, in the use of maritime militias. How do you respond to that? Cyber attacks, how do you respond to that? The agenda is growing, but what we're seeing is India becoming more and more included in the fold, if you like, of the network of the interoperable nature of the relationship between Japan, Australia, and the United States, who are allied with the United States, not directly Australia and Japan, but with the United States. There's a level of interoperability with our systems, with our protocols, our procedures, and our networks that hasn't so far included India that much. And I suspect that we'll see that rise in the coming months, and that's probably going to be on the agenda as well. How do we boost interoperability? And for Australia, I think that means particularly in the maritime space, operating in a more interoperable way with India, with the Indian Navy and Air Force, in and through the Indian Ocean territories that we share. In India's case, the Andaman Nicobar, and in Australia, Cocos and Christmas, and how we operate across that northeastern corner of the Indian Ocean. So lots there to talk about, lots of issues to discuss. My concern is that they really do need to grapple more with the environmental ones, the pandemic being the most prominent at the moment, but the environmental ones, the felt needs, the needs that are articulated by groups like Pacific Island Forum, the countries of the Pacific that are subject to significant influence, and great power contestation is alive and well in the Pacific, particularly in the South Pacific at the moment. And so responding to those felt needs is a really critical one for the Quad countries to rise and respond to appropriately. India has connections with the Pacific, particularly through the diaspora in Fiji, but elsewhere as well. Japan's invested in this space. Australia has tended to see it as its backyard, particularly alongside with New Zealand, its traditional partner in the South Pacific, but working closely with New Guinea, with Papua New Guinea, with Solomon Islands, with Fiji, and the other island nations of the Pacific is going to be really important.
Thank you, sir. Professor, the US has launched a large-scale all-domain military exercise in the Indo-Pacific region with Britain, Australia, and Japan, which also coincides with Chinese military training during parts of the South China Sea. So according to you, what signal is the US and participating countries trying to convey to their adversaries, including China, since the exercise is also the first of its kind in more than 4 decades?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, Pramod. Thank you for the question. It's very interesting to see the involvement of countries that have not played a prominent role in East Asian affairs or Indo-Pacific affairs for a long time. And here I'm thinking about Britain, France, the Netherlands, Germany even. These are all countries that once upon a time had considerable colonial footprints in this part of the world, obviously, but haven't for a long time. We're talking about half a century ago. So this is not something that's, I think, a resurgence of that, really. The exception, obviously, being with France in its Pacific Island territories. But I think it's interesting to think about where things are going. And these are countries that are actively pursuing an engagement with the United States, alongside the United States and Japan and Australia and India as well, in pushing back and basically sending a signal to China that, look, you may well be at the other end of the Eurasian landmass to us people in Europe, but we're not happy with what you're doing. And we're conscious that in this world where we're all connected, actions at your end, the eastern end of the Eurasian landmass, affect ours as well. And there's also, I think, a recognition amongst these European powers that it's in their interests to ensure that the United States remains active and engaged on these issues. So now look at, just for instance, at Britain with the deployment of the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier. Now, I think there's a range of motives for Britain doing this. One is they want to show off the aircraft carrier. They've just had Brexit, and they're trying to re-establish foreign policy that includes former Commonwealth countries that they've had connections with in the past, that they've let kind of atrophy and lapse to a certain extent, and they're trying to reinvigorate those relationships. But at the same time, they're also looking for trade opportunities. They want to show off British martial prowess and their equipment. They also, I think, want to get back a little bit at China because of what they've been doing in Hong Kong, and how the treaty that was signed in 1997 has been essentially abrogated by China. They also want to build up relations with Japan and bolster their ties with the five-power defence arrangement, one of the minilaterals we talked about. Five-power defence arrangement's a really interesting arrangement, actually, Pramod. It includes these former British Empire countries, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the UK. And it's interesting how these 5 countries find it really useful to keep it going. Now, this is an organisation that's now 50 years old this year. 1971 it was formed. The Five-Power Defence Arrangement, or FPDA, is on one level, it seems a bit of an anachronism, but on another, it's got a vitality that is remarkably youthful. And it appears to have considerable resilience. So even today, for instance, Indonesia, which was really kind of seen in adversarial terms once upon a time, is now invited and has observer status as liaison officers for FPDA events. So we're seeing a kind of change in the dynamics. It's quite interesting to watch, and it will be interesting to see how China responds to this, whether they have a degree of humility in response or whether they push back. I suspect they will push back. But I think in pushing back, they may well want to be mindful that they are more dependent and more vulnerable on the rest of the, more dependent on other countries and more vulnerable to the wishes of other countries than they perhaps would have liked. Interesting to think about the trade situation, for instance, with Australia. We've had a swag of sanctions imposed on Australia over beef, wheat, barley, wine, coal, etc. And yet Australian trade with China has actually grown. And of course, the other thing is that there is a view, it appears, in China that President Xi can exercise powers a bit like over the command economy of the past. But the global economy is not, it's not a command economy. There's ebbs and flows, trade waxes and wanes, economies do go through booms and busts, and there's supply and demand. And these variables are ones, China doesn't own those variables, it doesn't control them. It certainly can influence them, but not control them. And so Australia, like many other countries, are now seriously questioning the wisdom of further investing in the bilateral relationship and looking to diversify. And that's why it's so interesting, all these minilaterals you talk about. They're all efforts to diversify, to get away from over-dependence, over-reliance on the bilateral relationship with China, mindful that they are now using that as a bit of a tool against us, as a stick against us. And we therefore, in order to mitigate the risks of that, are looking to diversify. That's easier said than done, because once upon a time it was easy to, for Australians particularly, to go get a team and go to China and with one language do a loop around the country and do a whole series of deals and go back to Australia and pat each other on the back. Now it's much more difficult with Indonesia, with India, with other countries in Southeast Asia, with Japan, with Korea, etc. These free trade agreements are in place, but they're actually capitalizing upon them is just a little bit more challenging. And then I think that's where the future lies, engaging in that space on a more multilateral, bilateral, but multilateral as well, minilateral, as you suggest.
Thank you. Professor, you just talk about trade. So let's discuss more on this, because it's been a year since China started ramping up its campaign of trade punishment against Australia. What lesson can countries learn from Canberra's experience about how to manage the relations with Beijing? Also, in terms of having Australia back, what kind of support is being offered by its allies and US as a collective pushback?
So, yeah, thanks, Pramod. Look, I think the thing is that we need to realize that China likes to say it singles out individual countries for punishment. It's done it to Korea, it's done it to Sweden, it's done it to Norway, it's done it to Canada, it's done it to Japan, it's done it to Australia. We're not being singled out, folks. We're all in the same position. We're all essentially in the same position, and that is facing the challenge of a assertive and surprisingly arrogant China that sees its role as basically demanding subservience from states that don't see it in their interests to be subservient to China. And so I think there's a degree of miscalculation here on President Xi's part about the way the international order works. And my sense is that this may well come back to haunt him. And there are alternatives to this. And what we're seeing is that countries like Australia and others in the region are all looking on thinking, yeah, okay, this has been quite lucrative for us so far, but let's see what we can do about diversification. Let's see what we can do about finding other markets to mitigate the risk of being overly dependent on the Chinese market. And of course, the key country that's most exposed in this front are actually two of the Quad countries, Japan and the United States. The United States, which has, it was instrumental in allowing China to join the World Trade Organization 2 decades ago, has subsequently invested enormously in China with industrial plants from, Google, Apple, Boeing, major American corporations are heavily invested in China and are kind of, to a certain extent, subject to a bit of manipulation by Chinese authorities keen to exploit and capitalize on the opportunities. There's a reassessment, a realignment taking place in the United States, much as there is in Australia and Japan and elsewhere, in light of this. So I think what we're seeing is other countries, India as well, and of course, countries like Nepal, a bit like countries like New Zealand, small countries got limited freedom of action, limited leverage, but also not wanting to be completely beholden to one or the other, and looking to hedge their bets and kind of provide some space for them as a political entity to survive and thrive without being completely subsumed. So challenges ahead for all of us, that's for sure.
Thank you, sir. Being a former Australian Army officer and a war historian, how do you assess the evolution of Australia's defense strategy over the years? What are Australia's current strategic policy challenges and opportunities?
So thank you. Look, there's a book by an Australian leading figure, thinker and writer called Alan Gingell, and the book is called Fear of Abandonment. And it is, I guess, it's a really telling title for a book because it speaks to Australia's predicament as this kind of Western European transplanted community on the edge of Asia that over the last 50 or so years, since we got away from the White Australia policy, has become actually quite a multicultural society, quite inclusive and quite diverse, and more engaged with Asia than ever before. But it's at the same time, its sense of identity remains Western, largely Western. Our institutions are, common law, British-derived legal system, open bicameral parliamentary, federal parliamentary model, which is, it's British-derived, but it's essentially modeled on the European models of governance and of society that, there are echoes of it throughout the world. I mean, ironically, even China, communist country of China, where does communism come from? Karl Marx and Lenin. These are the Europeans, for crying out loud. European models. So I find it ironic that China is asserting itself on the back of a Jewish German migrant to the UK who was very successful selling a book, Das Kapital. And so, we live in a world today that is more interconnected, less unicultural, less distinctive, less kind of separate than ever before. We're more connected than we've ever been. We have people, Australia, for instance, has over 4% of our population today is from South Asia. Another 4% or so is from Southeast Asia, and another 4 or 5% is from Northeast Asia. So that's in addition to the migrants from Europe and from Africa and from Latin America. So we're kind of looking around. There is still a concern about that idea of being fear of abandonment, but we're also seeing that our place in the world is much more interconnected and much more dependent in a codependent way with our neighbours in the Indo-Pacific. So that makes for interesting times ahead, interesting security and economic and political challenges that we all share. And how we respond to the pandemic, I think, is illustrative of that. So Australia's engagement trying to help out in the Pacific, sending vaccines to Papua New Guinea, to Fiji, to Solomon Islands, and elsewhere, to Indonesia, and collaborating with India and Japan and the US on trying to facilitate additional supplies around the world. This is the new normal. I think that's fair to say, Pramod.
Thank you, sir. Australia has recently disclosed plan to use $581 million elevating its military bases and growing joint exercise with the United States. It's amidst the risk of a confrontation with China. So according to you, how different and significant is this decision?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch what the decision was.
Let me repeat the whole question. Australia has recently disclosed plans to use $581 million elevating its military bases and growing joint exercise with the United States amidst the risk of a confrontation with China. So according to you, how different and significant is this decision?
So I think this is significant. What I think it shows is a recognition that Australia needs to put its money where its mouth is. In other words, in Australia, we've been kind of doing the opposite of that axiom from Teddy Roosevelt, that US president from the beginning of the 20th century, who said, we speak softly but carry a big stick. And in Australia's case, I think we've been speaking a bit loudly and carrying a small stick. So I think there's a recognition in Australia that if we want to be more assertive in terms of our values and our interests, then we need to double down on capabilities to back that up. The stick needs to be a bit bigger, if you like. And that means we've got to invest in capabilities. If we want to deter aggression, you actually need to be credible in what you have on offer to conduct that deterrence. And our military capability, while it is very useful for helping with pandemics and floods and fires and tsunamis and crises in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, it's an insurance policy against the prospect of war. We all know that. Every country does that. But for it to be a credible insurance policy, you need to have it reasonably robust. It can't just be something that's an easy pushover. And in Australia's case, my sense is that what we have in our Defence Force today is a Defence Force designed for the unipolar moment. Those days immediately after the Cold War ended, when it was clear, when Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history, the United States democracy had won, the United States was top dog, and we didn't have to spend that much on our own defence anymore. I think that moment has passed, and there is a growing realisation that the dynamics are perhaps more akin to those of the 19th century, where there was considerable great power contestation and needing to be more mindful of the Machiavellian nature of international politics. And I guess it speaks to a degree of disappointment about the United Nations and other mechanisms like that because of the limited power of those institutions when they are subject to the veto power of the great powers. And that's the world we live in today.
Thank you, sir. The last question for today. Apart from India, how do you look at Australia's engagement in South Asia in general and Nepal in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Pramod. Look, Australia and Nepal, Australians have very fond connections with Nepal, and there are many Nepali migrants to Australia. Our family has considerable connections with Nepal on a personal level, and that is, I think, reflects an interest that is been something that probably faded for a while maybe in the later Cold War years. When you think about the way the British Empire unravelled, when that happened, Australia tended to retreat back from its connections across the Indian Ocean to the older parts of the British Empire that we had previously been connected to quite well. And I think we're seeing a resurgence in that. So we're seeing India clearly becoming much more prominent in Australia's strategic calculus, in our diplomatic footprint, in our trade endeavours. We've considerable trade initiatives in that space now. And similarly with Bangladesh and Nepal and Bhutan as well, there's an interest there in engaging more closely because there's a recognition that we're actually all in the same kind of boat, in the same sort of circumstances, although not too many boats or ships in Nepal now, other than on lakes and rivers. But essentially, we're seeing a re-emergence of the significance of Nepal amongst the South Asian states to Australia's engagement with the Indo-Pacific more broadly. And I think you may see, Pramod, a resurgence in interest and that goes beyond the warmth of affection and affinity between Australia and Nepal. That is about the connection with the Himalayas, the sense of adventure of Australians going to Nepal. My wife has been, I have not. We've talked about going together in the future, and that is, I think, my sense is, and it's an anecdotal perspective to be fair, but there's a warmth towards Nepal from Australia and many other places in the world that is ripe for deepening and broadening. And I think we're on the cusp of that. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor John Blaxland, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Pramod. Namaste.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice day.